Good day, everybody. Welcome to the third of our series of workshops on reconnecting people and nature. My name is Rodolfo Dirzo, and I am talking to you on behalf of my colleagues, Luisa Yenes, Marta Pelaez, and Chinmay Sonowane from Stanford University. We want to welcome you to this workshop, which is the third of a series in which we have addressed different topics that um, have as an objective to appreciate the beauty and the significance of reconnecting people and nature. The workshop today addresses a different topic compared to what we did before. The first one was on food security and biodiversity and sustainability. There was a lot of elements there on environmental justice and recognition of indigenous people. Second one was on the combinations of art and science and nature. And today we're going to be talking about wildlife trade in the Anthropocene. Before we move on to the details of our workshop today, I want to recognize that we are on the land of the Moweg Maolone, the ancestral people who are the owners of this land, where we live, work, and play. And we want to recognize their perseverance, dedication, and the maintenance and stewardship of this beautiful land in California. And I hope that invites you also to recognize the ancestors of your lands wherever you are with us today. Thank you so much. I wanted to bring up some preamble to our discussions of today by addressing this question of wildlife trade in the Anthropocene. As some of you might have heard, this fantastic professor, Paul Crutzen, came up with the idea of thinking of the current situation of our planet as deserving to have a name in terms of given the profound footprint impact that we're having on the planet. And he suggested that we should be calling this times not the Holocene, but instead call it the Anthropocene. And so the Anthropocene is this era of global environmental change. And if you're interested, you can read that idea of Paul Crutzen in that short paper in that little journal, Nature, in 2002. There is a number of manifestations of the Anthropocene, and this busy slide here is meant to give you a rough indication. You don't have to worry about the details, but if you look at the left-hand side panel of this graph, you have a number of variables, a number of manifestations, which have to do with what we as society do. So these are the socioeconomic trends. And you can see multiple of those, and I put some stars for the ones that I am the most impacted by, but you can think of the ones that you prefer to. So you can think of the increase in fertilizer consumption. These are graphs showing through time the trends in increase in the use or impact of these socioeconomic trends, such as fertilizer consumption, or the production of large dams, or the use of water and the production of paper, and so on and so forth. Well, all of those activities that you see on the left-hand side panel are showing a tremendous acceleration, particularly as from the decade of the 1950s. If you look at the panels on the right-hand side, all of those have to do with variables that have to do with Earth system trends. Most of them, as you can easily imagine, have to do with climate-related changes or anthropogenic impact. The three graphs at the bottom, those are more biological. They have to do with the loss of tropical forests, starting on the left, the domesticated land, which is essentially the transformation of nature, the land that used to hold nature into something else. And then the one on the right has to do with the situation of species that are recognized as being threatened by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. What you can see is this process of acceleration of impact on the planet. From the biological perspective, as you all imagine or you know, land use change and deforestation has been the most visible one. And we have a very clear understanding or vivid images of deforestation because we have this amazing technology, which is remote sensing technology. And with that kind of technology, we can have situations where you can have illustrations such as the one that you see here. This is an amazing map put together by the Global Forest Watch showing what must have been the closed forest 8,000 years ago. And this is a significant time, actually, because this is when we humans began to spread around the planet and then began to impacting the planet in a more significant way. Now, But because we know the current rates of deforestation, we know relatively well the current rates of deforestation, we can produce scenarios. So a business as usual scenario, whereby we maintain the current rates of deforestation, predicts that we might move to a situation of the closed forest to a situation like as what you see in this horrible map. My point here is that by having this fantastic technology, we can make predictions, projections, models, and some inferences, such as the one that I'm going to show you in a minute. Given this business as usual, we can estimate that under this current trends of deforestation, several millions of hectares of wild forest ecosystem will be converted by the year 2050. And as I said, these are very vivid images of what is happening with what we do with nature. Unfortunately, this technology does not allow us to see what is happening with animal life. And for that reason, in our lab, we have introduced this term, defaunation, to convey the notion that just as we're losing plant life, we're also impacting dramatically animal life. And that's going to be a central theme of our conversation today, including what we can do or what we're doing about addressing this problem of defaunation. Let me give a rough idea first of the magnitude of this issue by showing these three bars in this graph. The one on the left shows the biomass of wildlife 10,000 years ago. And W here means wildlife, animals essentially. You can see that most of the biomass, the 300 million of tons at the time, were contributed by wildlife. There's a little bit with that age on top of the graph, which represents the biomass of humans at the time. Fast forward to year 1900 in the center of this graph, and you can see that the total biomass is about the same, but now we have an increase in age, the human population, and a new element coming here, the domesticated animals. So D there represents what happened there. Because the total biomass is about the same, that implies a dramatic reduction in W, which is wildlife. Move fast forward to 2015, which is essentially today, and then you see two dramatic. One is a whooping increase from 300 to 1,850 total biomass, and now the biomass of the human population is gigantic, and you can see in the age there, but the increase in the biomass of the domesticated animals is just incredibly gigantic, with a tremendous reduction in wildlife. The little section that you see with 23 arrows indicated 23, that's what we have left in terms of biomass at the moment. So that situation has a number of implications, which would be interesting to discuss, but we don't have time to do so. But let me just show you a couple of slides to illustrate that. You see there a day in the life of a market in Lagos, Nigeria, which tells you this increase in domesticated animals. And you can easily imagine these animals have to come from some land. So that means the tremendous transformation of the land to maintain the situation, and the constraints and limitations and the challenges that we put on top of the wildlife. In terms of what are the drivers of these dramatic changes in nature and wildlife, we now know that land use change is, at least at the moment, the most impactful one, as you can see in this diagram showing the relative impact by the size of the circles, followed by direct exploitation. And those two drivers, number one, number two, are the most dramatic ones in terms of what is happening to wildlife, and trade and movement represent one of the most important ones from the point of view of direct exploitation. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight in this diagram is that all of these factors do not operate in isolation. You can see that they're statistically and realistically connected in different complex ways. So our understanding, addressing these critical issues, has to be based on an understanding of these complex interactions. And this is another topic that we're going to be talking about today. Let me move on to an illustration of the situation that I tried to indicate in the previous slide, the connections among the drivers. And here you see sort of a pictorial illustration of that. I wanted to use this slide because I wanted to touch on the first one, direct exploitation, which is hunting, trading, the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about today. But the picture that I have included here is to address an issue of environmental injustice related to direct exploitation. You see a photo there of a person in Africa in which this person has to hunt bats for that person to get some food. That is a terrible environmental injustice situation. How can we permit that society today forces some communities to have to rely on these activities to be able to have some. We might come back to discussion of the social implications of these kinds of deformation elements. All right, moving on to some aspects that might be more directly related. Let me show you some data that I have rescued from the traffic bulletin, which is a publication of the CITES that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. You can see a selection of sites on the x-axis that represent the proportion of the activity of hunters in two kinds of activities: commercial in the red bars and hunting in the in the yellow bar. And as you can see, for most places, what is really impactful in terms of the hunting activities is the commercial, most of it illegal activities of extraction of animal life. Only in some places, some remote places, such as what you see on the right-hand side, the Manu National Park, is mostly hunting by local people for sustaining themselves. And so what you see is that what we have today is a predominant of commercial, mostly illegal hunting, acting dramatically on our wildlife today. I have taken some data, again, of the traffic bulletin to try and illustrate some of the things that we're going to be talking about today, which is the number of seizures as indicators of the impact of trading on wildlife. You can see in this graph the trends of the number of seizures through the last few decades. You can see that the number of seizures as an indicator of the magnitude of this activity is not stopping, it's increasing. And in some years, like in the year 2010, dramatic, really, really dramatic. And there are a number of businesses associated to that. And that photo there in the insert illustrates the case of the ivory trade. Now, if we want to ask what kinds of animals, what groups of animals are impacted, this pie chart indicates that mammals are a major source of a major attraction for this activity, followed by reptiles. There also is one case that represents that situation. And within the mammals, we want to look in more detail as to what are the types of species that are being more trafficked. You can see that elephants and pangolins are also critical elements. And then you have a cornucopia for the animals that are also being very impacted. You might imagine the consequences of this kind of trade. For example, in the case of the pangolin, as you might have heard, the genome of this animal is very similar to the genome of the viruses that transmit horrible things such as SARS and so on. Okay, all of that is leading to a dramatic decline in the abundance of animals. Even though the species might not have gone extinct, the abundances are declining dramatically. In some cases, as you can see in this graph, almost to the point of collapse in some very significant species. So we have a big problem in front of us. But to finish, let me finish with a more cheerful note, because we do know that some populations, particularly some groups of people interacting with local populations, have managed to change the trends. I wanted to illustrate this graph here, put together by Mazaris et al. In the Science magazine 2019, in which they show, for the case of these amazing animals, green turtles, that things can be done. But these green circles illustrated in this map of the world indicates locations where there's upward trends in the recovery of these very impactful activities that used to have a dramatic consequence on the populations of these amazing animals. And the reason why these upward trends are occurring around the planet is because people with different areas, different interests, and different disciplines are working together with local communities to see these promising trends that we see today. So with that cheerful note, I want to open the rest of our discussion today because we're going to be talking about some of the dramatic issues, but also some of the things that can be done and some of the things that we would hope going forward in this situation of reconnecting people and nature in the Anthropocene. And with that, I'm going to pass the microphone to my colleague, Marta Peláez, who's going to be introducing the first speaker. Marta, please.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo. Today, it is my honor to introduce Ivonne Higuero, our distinguished first speaker for this wildlife trade workshop. Yvonne has an impressive career spanning 26 years in international organizations and has become a prominent figure in the field of sustainable development. Since 2018, she is the Secretary General of CITES, as you all know, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Ivonne is an environmental economist that has used her expertise to manage and oversee the implementation of many programs of work, ensuring the conservation of endangered species and the sustainable use of natural resources. We are truly privileged to have Ivonne Higuero here this morning, talking about the remarkable efforts of CITES in regulating the wildlife trade during the last 50 years. Thank you, Ivonne.
Thank you so much, Marta, for this introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. And I'm really happy that Rodolfo had the opportunity to speak before me, because I think I'm going to be able to address some of those issues that he brought up. And I think sometimes even be a little controversial in the discussion that we have about what is really driving defaunation, as you called it, and deforestation. So it'll be, I think it's always good. We have in these days, in the work that we're doing with CITES, often polarization between views and extreme views. And I think that we need to go back to the times when we could sit around the table, all of us, and discuss the issues and try to find good solutions and not be so polarized. Have some empathy, I think, also for those who are living near wildlife, the people who live close to wildlife, and really at the end become very responsible for ensuring that that wildlife, and when I say wildlife, I mean both plants and animals, can survive in the wild also for future generations, not for now. But we have to look at livelihoods, and we have to look at economic aspects of it too. So I think this is going to be a really good discussion. So I'm so pleased to be here now. I'll share my screen so I can start my presentation. Okay, so a little talk about, this is our birthday year of 50th, half a century of existence. CITES was created in 1973, agreed in 1973, and came into effect in 1975. So we're celebrating the 50 years of it being agreed amongst the parties at that time, and those who were negotiating this great agreement. So I'll mention a few things, and I think I have 30 minutes to speak. Let me know when I'm getting close to the time that I'm from Latin America. We like to talk a lot, so I'm always happy to somebody to tell me when I need to wrap up. So on the agenda I have here, introduction to CITES, the purpose of CITES. So a little bit about the governance of CITES, the structure, the types of trade that are covered by CITES, the regulations, because that's basically what CITES does, is regulate the wildlife trade, the appendices, Appendix 1, 2 to 3, and the requirements for trade under CITES. And then a little bit about CITES programs and activities that I think would be interesting to you, and a few words about illegal wildlife trade that was mentioned by Rodolfo earlier, and then some resources that I'm sharing with you for future reference. So for those of you who are not familiar with CITES, a little bit of a primer about what it's about. Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, and as I mentioned, signed back in 1973 on the 3rd of March and entered into force in 1975. And here you see a black and white picture for when it was signed and entered into force, the signing of the convention before the entering into force. And you see a room full of men, mostly men there. And you'll see that now, if I think I have another picture that shows the difference, that now we're very, very, very gender diverse in this work. In fact, I'm the first female Secretary General to head CITES since 1975. So things are changing also in the world of conservation and wildlife. So who is involved in CITES? And many are surprised that it's an almost universal convention. Now with 184 signatory parties, that includes the European Union as a signatory parties. Then we have the governance of CITES, that where we have the Conference of the Parties, which takes the decision. And this is when almost the 184 parties meet. We don't always have 184 parties present, but every 2-3 years they get together and decide on the next steps for CITES and what are the priorities for CITES for the intersessional period between the time that they meet. And this intersessional period is governed by what we call the Standing Committee, which is the senior committee under the Conference of the Parties. And they convene twice, most of the time, between the COPs, between what we call the COPs. And they have the delegated authority from the COP to take decisions during this intersessional period. Then along with that, we have two other committees, scientific committees, We just had our plants committee last week meeting, very busy, lots of discussion on plants, not always as full of people as we have for the animals committee, which will be next week. And I think that's a shame. I think that there's a lack of understanding of the incredible importance of plants, and particularly when we think about ecosystem and what's happening, especially as you're talking about deforestation, land conversion. You know, plants have a huge role in all of this, and I think we need to pay much more attention to it. And then, of course, the Secretariat, of which I'm the lead, based in Geneva, Switzerland, where I have a small team, I have to say, of colleagues, but very dedicated and very hardworking to make sure that we can move forward on the purpose of CITES. And you're going to see that we have to make sure, imagine along with the parties, support them to make sure that international trade in wild fauna and flora does not threaten species survival. We're thinking about the future generations and to make sure that these species continue to exist, and we know that they are part of the ecosystem and need to about the ecosystems, and that helps us in our daily lives. I'll say something. Sorry, I'm closing the window because it's warm, but it's also very noisy outside. Sorry about that. And so then it's basically a regulatory convention. It's about conservation, but it is about trade. And we provide a licensing system with permitting that with this permit, you can know if you can trade in these animals and plants. More people are every day surprised about how many species are covered by CITES, 40,900 species to this date. But the great majority are plants, and then in a minority animals. And as I said, they're listed in 3 appendices, and it'll be according to the degree of protection needed. So those species in Appendix 1 have the maximum protection, and you will see in a bit how, in fact, most of the species are under Appendix 2. 97% of those species that are listed can be traded. So it's called the Convention for Endangered Species, but what we're in some cases, it is that way under Appendix 1, but our Appendix 2, there's threats, and we have to make sure that trade doesn't make worse those threats and harm the existence of these species. So also very importantly to understand about how CITES makes decision is that it is a science-based convention. And we have ways in which, of course, when the proposals come in about which species to list under CITES, these proposals have to be scientifically based, showing how trade, and this is something that's very important, and we need to ensure that there's no misunderstanding about what the primary effort is of CITES, which is to ensure that trade is not threatening the existence of these species. However, there are some species that are already in a threatened situation that are on the brink, and any trade in those situations, even if it's not a large amount of trade, any trade in those situations could push those species to be on the brink of survival. And even if it's not trade, the one that's mostly threatening them, they can also be listed just to make sure that there's no trade to put them further in danger. And again, CITES is really a big platform that not only are represented by the countries, but are also represented by many advocacy groups. We have non-governmental organizations and industry coming to discuss the issues and presenting their views to have balance between, of course, because science is not in a vacuum and we have to look at other issues that could be affecting the species. So here you can see, this was the recent plants committee that just happened last week. It was an all-women podium with a chair from Gabon. Things that, like I said, are changing very rapidly in this world. And one of the very important aspects of these animals and plants committees that they review is significant trade, really paying attention to how much trade in species is occurring. This gives a warning signal that something has to be reviewed, investigated, discussed with the countries, the range states of these species, to make sure that how much trade can be allowed, because maybe there's overexploitation. So we have a database of legal trade that is managed by the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center. And when we have every time that we, once every COP, there's a decision about what countries should be reviewed, and they do what they would call a country species combination. So we see the range state for a particular species, and how much of that species is being traded, and if there's been large amounts that have increased over time, and maybe shows a warning that something needs to be regulated better there. And so they have to submit a non-detriment finding, which I will discuss in a moment, to be able to have a detailed review of this scientific document, which is the non-detriment finding. And these committees are going to evaluate these documents, these reports, to ensure that maybe some of them have to go under what we call, it's a type of compliance procedure, where even sometimes they are asked to not trade, to put a zero quota until the situation gets resolved and more information is made available about how much trade is happening. And so there's this procedure is followed then by the standing committee, where the scientific committees, either animals and plants, give their opinions, give their recommendations to the standing committee. And again, as I said, they're the intersessional body that is going to review these recommendations and make decisions in between the COPs. So what kind of trade is covered by CITES? And this is also something that is surprising for many people. It's food, fish, wild meat, plant food. So it's not the species itself, it's also specimens and the products from these species. Housing and furniture, when we think about wood, timber, and other materials to make houses. Imagine the amount of pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, fragrances that come, and health also, medication, often it's these it's not necessarily medication, but they're the ones that are being sold as, you know, having improve your health, and therefore are very popular to be sold. So there's regulations on those that contribute to these pharmaceutical companies. And you see here some cosmetics. There's many that add color, plants that add color to cosmetics, certain orchids that add a certain perfume to the industry. So all of these, many of these types of products are regulated by CITES. If you think about wood and musical instruments, there are also many of these are very rare types of wood that need to be regulated by CITES. We just had a discussion about pau brasilia, which is used to make bows for violins. Some concerns about maybe some illegal trade going on there. Pets, ornamentals, many of these species on the CITES list and are regulated, that they can only be traded with permits. If you think about tourism, not only the wildlife that you see if you go on safari, but also many of these botanical gardens and museums that have these types of species. And finally, in fashion, many of these high fashion industry companies are using leathers, furs, fibers, and making jewelry with some of these CITES listed species. So a great variety are covered. So here again, to understand the regulations of trade regulations under CITES, they are covering with certificates and permits, the importing and exporting and re-exporting of products or raw materials. It could be from a piece of wood to a scientific sample that is being sent across borders. And it can be live, it can be dead, and again, parts or derivatives. It doesn't have to be the raw material itself. And now lately, a lot of discussion about introduction from the sea, because there's fishing going on in the high seas, and now this is being introduced, and sometimes introduced to one port and then re-exported to another port. Hard to keep track. Some of them are not aware about CITES regulations, and therefore they need to be made more aware that if they're importing or taking from the sea certain species that are listed under CITES, they cannot be traded without a permit. So on the CITES appendices, as I mentioned before, there's 3 appendices. Appendix 1, the most protected of species. There's all sorts of animals and plants on here. You mentioned the pangolin, now completely under Appendix 1, which means no international trade is allowed, only for scientific purposes. And what is the coveted material from pangolins are its scales, used in traditional medicine, and really the most endangered mammal at this moment in the world. Appendix 2 are other species where there's concerns about their survival and therefore need to be regulated with a permit. Like I said, 97% of those listed on CITES can be traded, but they have to be regulated with a permit. And I'll say in a moment what is underlying those permits, because it's not just handing over a permit, they have to be based on legal and scientific grounds. And finally, with Appendix 3, which it's when there's some concerns about in a single country, at least a single country is asking other parties to help with its protection. So here's about the numbers of those that are under the different appendices: 700 species of fauna, 400 species of flora, more than 32,000 species of flora, 5,000 species of fauna, and countries, single countries or a group of countries that are range states concerned that maybe trade is impacting on the survival of this particular species, and asking others to help it with a permitting system, is about 200 species. Sometimes they later can move to Appendix 2 depending on how the trade data that they find. So again, trade generally prohibited for Appendix 1. Really, it's the highest protection. There's protection with Appendix 2 because it's controlled, and then Appendix 3, which is permitted similarly, but also controlled at the request of parties. So here are some examples of species that are under Appendix 1. Again, a number of plants and animals that have been significantly traded over time. A lot of birds, a lot of beautiful flowers. In the Plants Committee meeting, we had South Africa speaking that they're now very concerned about succulents, that there's a lot of illegal trade in succulents, and where they're saying that you can see in a few years the difference of the landscape from when they had 10 years ago fully covered with succulents and now almost disappearing because of this high trade. So concerns, people who are collectionists, who want to have certain types of pets, eggs of certain birds being hidden and transferring between states on planes. This is a concern for CITES for these Appendix 1 species, including products, including derivatives, as mentioned by ivory and rhino horn and the pangolin scales. In Appendix 2, again, the larger number of species here, you can see also amphibians now are coming to the attention of CITES, and more are becoming listed. There was an interesting one called the glass frog that was now recently put on Appendix 2, where there's permitting needed to be able to trade in glass frog. And what it is, that collectionists like it because if you look at the underbelly of this frog, you can see all its internal organs. And again, collectionists who are fascinated by these type of creatures also wanting to trade in them. Turtles, tortoises, many cacti being traded that need to be having a permit before they can be traded. And Appendix 3, here's a few of those under Appendix 3, including even wood and timber, and I'll talk a little bit about that a little later, where countries are concerned about the trade. Again, not only the animals and plants, but the products. So the customs authorities will be looking very carefully when these products are traded, when they're using skins, when we're looking at musical instruments, to make sure that they have the permits. Orchestras, which they participate quite a lot in CITES, and they're very much paying attention to if they have a permit accompanying them when they're traveling. So as I mentioned, it's not only just to have the permitting, but the whole aim of CITES is to ensure that trade is legal, sustainable, and traceable. And to be able to do this, the countries have to carry out these mandatory, really the basis, the foundation of the conventions, which one of them, the scientific one, is called the non-detriment findings, where there has to be a study of that particular species. Sometimes quotas are established. Sometimes there's basically just some determination of how much can be harvested in a certain period to ensure that it's sustainable and that it's not going to harm the existence of this species in the wild. Then we have also with legality, the legal acquisition finding, which is also mandatory to know from the moment that that species is taken from the wild until the final product, until the species is traded, that it has actually been legal all the way. That it, for example, if we take a tree, that from the moment that that tree was felled, it has to be shown that it was legally obtained, legally acquired. And this also helps with the traceability. So here's an example of a CITES permit. We are now trying to move, and this is an aside, I feel that the convention needs to come into the 21st century. Unfortunately, a lot of it's paper, And I think that paper is very difficult to keep track. It also can lend itself to mistakes and even corruption sometimes. So we're trying to make sure that the countries are now looking towards what we call electronic CITES and having better oversight over the permitting system by having this on a electronic system online, similar to what they do with other types of trade. So as I explained about the non-detriment findings, this is really an important scientific study that needs to be carried out. It's expressed very clearly in the articles of the convention that before an export permit can be issued, you have to prove that it is completely sustainable and it won't affect the species in the wild. And this has to be done by what we call the scientific authorities in CITES, and often they're universities or other agencies that deal with wildlife and science. And unfortunately, what we're finding now, and you may have heard that there was a ban on the exportation of certain a wood there's many rosewoods, but it's a type of rosewood coming from Central and Western Africa, because when there were concerns raised about overexploitation and illegal activity, when it was requested from these range states to send their non-detriment findings, also the legal acquisition findings, which I will show you in a minute, they could not produce those. They had not produced those non-detriment findings, so a ban was put on that export. And this is where we talk about a convention with teeth, because then no longer any ship would accept that timber for that type of rosewood, African rosewood, to be shipped elsewhere, because they knew that there was a ban, and those parties that are range states were not allowed to trade in that species. And I think that we then have to understand what is happening here. A lot of it simply is that we have to build capacity in these countries to understand the scientific work that has to be done under CITES to do these non-detriment findings, which are not easy and which have a cost associated with it. So I'll talk a short bit about sustainable financing and understanding how we can build capacity in the countries to do proper non-detriment findings to make sure that they're only trading what is sustainable. And again, it's a science-based risk assessment. Now, with legal acquisition findings, which is another requirement of the convention under the articles of the convention, again, as I said, it has to be done from beginning to end. And another issue that occurred with this trade ban on African rosewood is because the legal acquisition findings had not been carried out either. So, and this is basically something that has to be in their legislation, that has to be automatically done for these species, to know that there's a systematic review from the moment that it was acquired until the very end when it's being exported. So this is absolutely necessary. But again, we're having the discussions, we're prepared guidance, we're now doing trainings, and this is something that the Secretariat does, but we need to be able to help these countries to be able to do properly legal acquisition findings to be able to export legally. But the management authority of the state is the one that does the legal acquisition finding. And as I mentioned before, it's a scientific authority that does the non-detriment finding. So compliance is very important for CITES. Again, back in 1973, when this was agreed, I think everybody says today there would probably be no other convention like CITES because of these very strong compliance mechanisms where trade can be stopped if you're not following through with the compliance mechanism. So they have to do annual reporting, they have to have national legislation of a certain standard to be able to trade. We have this compliance where we're looking at is there too much trade going on. We look at the captive breeding. When those who are doing the captive breeding have to be able to should be registering those facilities, and a very, very important article under the convention, which is Article 13, which can lead to recommendations to suspend trade. And basically, if there's issues when an investigation is carried out and the Secretariat goes to the country and discusses the need for having a non-detriment finding, the need for having a legal acquisition finding, and we do not find this, trade is recommended to be suspended. And this is the decision that is taken by the Standing Committee, or the COP. It's a very dynamic convention. Here you see in color the most recent Standing Committee meeting that we had last year in Lyon in France. They are the ones that the Standing Committee is the one who's looking at these compliance measures, and they have the complete At this particular meeting was the one when the ban came on African rosewood, where it was required that when a certain period of time, the countries have to show their non-detriment findings and their legal acquisition findings, or they wouldn't be able to export, in this case, timber. Just to talk a little bit about this, sorry, there's that text, wrote a little bit about the 19th Conference of the Parties, which was just held in November last year in Panama, a very successful conference where a conference of the parties where we had more than 360 decisions that were taking, resolutions that were updating, new resolutions. For the first time, imagine after 50 years of existence of CITES, we have our first gender action plan. So we're very happy about that. And then decisions that were really covered by the press enormously, which were on marine species, particularly sharks and rays, and on timber species. And I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. One of the things that I would like to highlight, and again, this is the trends that we are seeing now. We're having many more marine species and many more timber species being added to the listings. And these are commercially viable, economically valuable species for many countries. And it's seen that there was too much overexploitation. We know what's happening with fisheries, but now we see also, as you mentioned, also with deforestation, that particularly very coveted precious wood, particularly this rosewood, is being traded too much is being traded. Now, obviously, this is a basis of economies of many countries. They have these are the resources that they have, these natural resources. So they should benefit from them, but they should benefit from them not in only thinking of today and mining the resource. There has to be care, and there has to be understanding that this trade has to be sustainable for future generations also to enjoy, but also for the functions that these trees have in the ecosystem. So we're trying to now have something we're trying to work on a resolution on CITES and forests to show how CITES is contributing to forest ecosystems, even if it's by single species, but it is very important because of all the illegal felling of and logging of trees, and also the over exploitation, even though sometimes it's with a permit, the proper scientific work hasn't been done. So one of the ways in which we're doing this and trying to help the countries is through the CITES Tree Species Program, which has been, we've had something like 70 outputs from this program over the last five years, to be able to provide small grants, direct assistance to the countries to do inventories. And I'll just say very quickly that one example, really bright example that came out of this was in Vietnam and in Laos as well, that when they finally did their non-detriment findings on Dalbergia, which is this type of rosewood, they themselves realized that they needed to stop the trade and put a zero export quota until they could get a handle on the stocks. And many of them are now leaning towards plantations on degraded lands rather than using the wild species. So this is another trend that's happening that can be discussed a bit further, that in our World Wildlife Trade Report, we can see that it's more artificial propagation and more captive breeding of CITES listed species than ever before. It's much less wild species being traded. So as I mentioned before, that with this increase of species of timber, we have now over 500 species of timber that is being regulated by CITES after the decisions of this last COP, and 100 sharks and rays that were added to CITES list. And the interesting issue here also is about identification. Often some of the trees may not be traded directly, but because of the difficulty in identification, this is another area in which we have to work harder with the customs authorities. They sometimes can't tell the difference between one species and another species. So we have lookalikes. Under CITES, you can also list lookalikes, and this has happened for both timber and sharks and rays. So this is where more and more, you see 500 species of timber, you see 100 sharks, but for some of them it's lookalikes. There's also some that are endangered for other reasons, as you mentioned, habitat loss being number one, and this is something that with any additional trade would cause huge damage. So a few words about illegal trade, and this is really I think personally that we need to talk a lot more about legal trade, because that's where a lot of the overexploitation can happen, and we need to make sure that it's legal and sustainable. But of course, we continue to fight against the illegal wildlife trade, because it's an incredible, the profits of illegal trade are huge. But they cannot, most of these items you see here, the ivory cannot be traded. This ivory, there's a ban on the ivory trade, and it's got to be, we have to fight against it, because even though, and then this is the good news, it has reduced. There is no doubt that this has reduced for many reasons, and this has, we have to talk a little bit about what that means with this reduction of the trade in ivory, and then also in the trade of rhino horn. And to a certain extent, we're not really sure. I think we're really still concerned about pangolin scales, because it's not looking good still for pangolins in terms of when we look at seizures. But we have to say that the enormous work that has been done in Africa and the African range states, poaching has gone down significantly. But this has now caused a rise in the populations of elephants in many of these countries, especially in the southern African countries. And now we're seeing an increasing problem with human wildlife conflict, which I think is another issue of interest that we have to take a look at, and again, understand what are the mechanisms and what options we can have about this. So we combat illegal wildlife crime through a joint initiative called IQWIC. And these are the organizations that are working with us, where we develop tools and instruments to be able to help countries fight against wildlife crime. And this is something that I very much like about this project, and I think this program, and I think we need to do more of this, where you're putting together different authorities. You have customs authorities working with police authorities, working with wildlife authorities, and increasing the communication of all of them together. Here are some resources online that you can find to be able to illustrate more about CITES. But I think from my point of view, I think after 50 years of CITES, I can say that there has been successes, but I think we also have to be concerned. We cannot say that all is going well. We see that there's still overexploitation. We're looking more towards timber and marine species that are being overexploited. And I think, but now also with the human wildlife conflict and with the growing populations of certain types of species, we have to see how we're going to fix that situation, because land conversion is also an issue. You talked about hunting by the local communities, and let's discuss whether this is something that we call injustice. I think the injustice is really where outside of those communities who actually need the protein, when we talk about fish, when we talk about animals, they maintain those habitats because they have access to them, because they are able to have benefit from them. So we have to find ways in which they can have incentives where they're not overexploiting, that they feel that they can still feed themselves and their families, and that if they're told that they're overexploiting, to give them the tools to not overexploit, but also find a way to give them incentives to continue allowing that habitat to exist for wildlife, because that really is my biggest concern, that if we are not careful with those who are living those livelihoods and those people living close to the wildlife resources, we may see even more land conversion, because they will say, what is in it for me if I don't benefit from this wildlife? If I don't benefit from these habitats, I might as well plant maize, or I plant soy, or something else. So I think this is a discussion we have to talk about, how resources, financial resources, can be transferred from the rich countries who want to have the existence of wildlife, who we are pleased with the existence of wildlife, but the burden, the cost of conservation are carried locally. So I think that this is something else to add into the pile of questions that may come later, just so to make it a little bit interesting, the discussion. Thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Yvonne, for providing us with this invaluable insight into the remarkable efforts of CITES in regulating the wildlife trade. And as I see here in the chat, your talk has also sparked some curiosity and engagement among our audience. I'm going to read you one of the questions. This is from Jerome, and he said, Hi, thanks for the great presentation. What is the difference between ICCWC and the TWEX database? Could you give an update on the African divide on the ivory issue? And can you give a quick outline of the gender action plan? It has more questions. If you want, I can read them later. Do you
It's
think?
fine. Should I go one by one, just
Yes.
because that one's a lot?
Okay.
So let me just say thank you so much for those questions, and thank you, Marta. IQUIC is actually a consortium between Interpol, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the World Bank, the World Customs Organization, and CITES. And what I really like about this initiative is that CITES being a legally binding agreement, and I should have said that from the very beginning, those parties who have signed it are legally bound to implement it. And the strength of CITES is that they have to go back home and they have to change, they may have to change legislation, they may have to put new regulations in to be able to then comply with CITES. So these organizations then take on the enforcement mandate, the enforcement decisions of the parties, and take it into their programs of work. So that if we talk about identification, for example, where there's difficulty in identifying trees, the World Customs Organization will work on that to train their customs authorities. You can't imagine the work of customs authorities when they're having to look at absolutely everything that comes through the borders. Now we're using more artificial intelligence, but to be able to tell what is allowed and what is not allowed. So that's the difference. And then, of course, there's an African divide on the ivory issue. It's the hot topic every time we have a conference of the parties that comes up, because some of the Southern African countries, particularly Zimbabwe last time in the COP19, they asked again, they were interested in seeing how they could, how they could be compensated for this ivory. I visited Zimbabwe myself. They have huge stockpiles under strict vigilance, where you have to use your eye to be able to open the room where this ivory is kept. They calculate it's worth $500 million, and they say to me, we're okay that we cannot trade in this ivory. We see this as our resource, because remember, poaching has gone down, and this is a lot of this ivory is from normal dead elephants, right? So they're thinking this is their resource, but they say, how do we get compensated? How do we get compensated for simply, if you want us to burn it, how can we get compensated? So that's the conversation, because why? They are the ones who have to invest in conservation. They're the ones who have to use these to be able to manage these protected areas. So again, this becomes a very hot issue there. The Gender Action Plan, very quickly, basically, we're just starting out. We're trying to ensure that when we look at women and trading and wildlife, how they're being connected, and if there's anything that may be detrimental to women because of the wildlife trade. If we look also about illegal trade, how women sometimes could be suffering because of that. It can affect livelihoods, it can affect families. So these are the kinds of things that we're looking at under the Gender Action Plan, but it's in development now. It was approved with the terms of reference on how we're going to develop the plan. I don't remember if there was something else, but I think that's pretty much, maybe another question.
Thank you. There is another question, and it's from Jan, and it's asking, what connection, if any, is there between national definition of endangered species, for example, US federal listing or listing of other countries, and the endangered species in the CITES appendix?
This is a really good question. Well, firstly, an interesting factoid is that when the treaty was signed, when the treaty was agreed, and remember it was signed in Washington, D.C., in fact, many of those species that were endangered in the United States just moved from their list onto the list of CITES species. So of course, for every country, when they're concerned about the well-being of a species because of trade, they come to the COP of CITES every 3 years now, and they put forward a proposal to say, what is the scientific evidence that the trade is affecting the species? So they can have it already on the list, but then they want it to be protected internationally. And so another interesting point of CITES is that CITES has sort of a minimum regulation which is quite high because of the fact that it's a strong convention and has compliance measures, but there can be stricter domestic measures that even animals and plants that may not be on CITES, but also with endemics, of course, it can be only on a list of a country, of a particular country, that they say that they decide that this cannot be traded. And it doesn't enter trade and it has nothing to do with CITES, but they can decide on those stricter domestic measures. Anything else?
No, I think we
Okay.
can follow the conversation later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ivonne, for your participation today.
My pleasure.
We're really
My
honored
pleasure.
to have you here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And now we are gonna turn our attention to our next speaker, Wen Zhou. And she's a brilliant PhD candidate in the combined degree between the Yale School of Environment and the Department of Anthropology. Her talk will center around the captivating topic of bushmeat hunting, sale, and consumption. And based on her experience in Central Africa, she will examine this topic through the framework of cultural values and practices. And throughout her talk, she will interrogate the origins of our instinctive reaction to bushmeat, highlighting the importance of reevaluating our perspectives and values in relation to bushmeat policies for a more inclusive and sustainable future. And with that introduction, I am thrilled to welcome Wen Zhou.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Marta, and for the invitation to present. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Let me see.
Perfect. We can see it perfectly.
That's
Thank you.
great. Super. So I wanted to thank the organizers again for inviting me and for inviting the co-panelists. I enjoyed Yvonne's presentation immensely, which also foreshadowed many of the themes that I will be speaking about in this presentation entitled Protein, Delicacy, and Crime, Bushmeat in the Age of Global Conservation. I want to start my presentation with a story. A few summers ago, I was doing research in rural northeastern Gabon, as you see in the map here in Central Africa, where I was living with a number of employees from a Chinese logging company, a company that had just arrived in the region. I came home one day to our shared house and found a cloth sack still wriggling with whatever was inside. The security guard told us it was a pangolin and that the forest manager of the logging concession wanted it killed for dinner. I was with a Chinese translator, a young girl in her 20s. She was translating for the company, and she asked, why were we eating the pangolin for dinner? The manager told her, well, he had bought it for 2,500 francs CFA, which is about $5 from the forest, and wanted it to serve the guests who were coming to dinner. It was something special to welcome our logging bosses, he said, something fitting for the occasion. And the next day, the pangolin was made into soup as part of a large Chinese feast. Such instances of bushmeat consumption by Chinese loggers were not unique in the time I spent in Gabon. For instance, I was told that other companies would give orders to hunt forest elephants when they were receiving their own customers from China. These are customers for their timber, to give them a taste of the wild on their very first trip to Africa. I think we can draw a few initial assumptions from this story. First, that the large-scale arrival of Chinese logging companies has created new demands for bushmeat in Central Africa. Second, that the Chinese only prove what we might have already suspected about them, where their cultural alterity is demonstrated by their radically different food preferences, as well as their lack of environmental consciousness that leads to the unjustified killing of protected species. And these assumptions are not entirely untrue, right? The arrival of Chinese players in new exotic forest surroundings have led to a demand for the unfamiliar bushmeat of the region, ranging from wild boar to pangolin to elephant. At the same time, however, we might come to question the bases of our assumptions just a little bit later. For now, I want to turn our attention to the rural hunters and households from whom the Chinese are ordering and purchasing their bushmeat. What are the stakes of hunting and eating bushmeat among people for whom bushmeat has always been the primary source of protein? I think it's impossible for any of us to deny the importance of bushmeat as an essential part of a rural diet when there are no other sources of animal protein. And here in this image, you see the cooking of a caught porcupine. In these areas, the domestication of animals or of livestock has been previously attempted and failed. But we must also recognize this culturally ingrained taste for wild meat, based on long millennia of hunting in these equatorial forests. Gabon's populations have been historically small, as well as nomadic, moving from one forest camp to another when local game populations in the surrounding area have been diminished. This dispersion and movement of small numbers of people across the landscape would have mitigated any concentrated impact on wildlife. And then you see on the top left a map of the location of villages in the forest around 1911. However, colonial and then post-colonial policies to resettle villages along the sides of roads and rivers, first to facilitate the collection of mandatory taxes, and second to recruit forced labor for road construction projects, as well as for rubber and ivory harvesting for European markets, resulted in the sudden transformation of local lifeways in these new permanent and fixed settlements. You see on the lower right then the arrangement of villages along these major roads and rivers in 1970. This rearrangement of villages in the landscape then has led to an increase in inter-village competition for game, the loss of control over clan-based hunting territories, as well as the creation of now constant pressures on surrounding populations of targeted game. Nonetheless, and as Yvonne mentioned in her presentation, subsistence hunting alone is unlikely to compare to the aggregated demand for bushmeat from other sources, whether it be the newly arrived Chinese logging companies or demand from cities on the coast. Bushmeat, however, has another incarnation in Gabon as a key source of local income. Here in rural northeastern Gabon, permanent wage labor is rare, and men often travel to the provincial capital of Makoko or the national capital, Libreville, to look for work. Already, there are many villagers that do not have hunters at all because of this rural exodus. On the other hand, for those families with young men of hunting age, the capture and sale of bushmeat on the side of the road, as you see here, can be one of the only ways that a rural household can earn a little bit of cash to pay for school expenses or for medicine, or to help save up for a dowry before marriage. Increasingly, however, it's the story of hunger that drives the sale of bushmeat. In northeastern Ogooué-Vindo province, as throughout rural Gabon, the forest elephant has become an impossible to control agricultural pest. Their now constant presence in the household fields of manioc and bananas are attributed, one, to the arrival of poaching pressure from the north, from Cameroon, but also from the disturbances they face in the increasing rates of industrial logging in surrounding forests. On the other hand, the conservation successes of Gabon's national parks, established in 2002 following the American conservationist Mike Fay's mega transect across the Republic of the Congo through the equatorial forest to the coast of Gabon, led to the creation of Gabon's first national parks, so a network of 13 national parks. Gabon in the aftermath of this creation, has been globally celebrated as a site of wildlife conservation. A name, given by National Geographic to the country is that this is the last Eden on Earth. Gabon now harbors then the largest population of remaining forest elephants in the world. But this is in part due to the biophysical conditions created not only by the establishment of the national park system, but by the colonial policies of resettlement, which have sought in its developmental aspirations to disentangle the human from the forest. The creation of these logging concessions, the creation of these national parks, which you can see in this map in the light green blocks, alongside the logging concessions, which you can see in the darker green blocks, which cover really the remainder of Gabon's forests, would seem to have then pushed rural peoples to their very limits. And the national roads where the villages are located are present in these red lines across the map. Already, the range of motion available to villages has been reduced by the legacy resettlement to a span of about 5 kilometers on either side of the road. This is the area that is allocated for rural livelihood activities. However, the pressures of elephant predation have meant that local households have needed to plant their staple crops of banana and manioc closer and closer to their homes, thus on increasingly restricted and depleted lands. As elephants leave the forest to enter the spaces of the villages, there's nowhere left to go. Many villages in northeastern Gabon here have stopped growing crops entirely, telling me that such efforts only go to waste, only go to feed the elephant. So what does this mean for rural lifeways, rural foodways, and for bushmeat consumption? Now, bush families are hunting and selling bushmeat on the side of the road in order to purchase rice, manioc, and bananas. For the first time, then, these rural villages need to purchase their dietary staples in the face of the impossibility of continuing agriculture. A 20-kilogram bag of rice, for instance, can cost around 10,000 francs CFA, which is around $20, which is about as much as you'd earn from the sale of a small gazelle. But of course, a bag of rice can feed your family for far longer than a single animal can. As bushmeat then becomes a primary source of income, not just for necessary cash expenditures, for school fees, for medicine, but also to exchange into an alternative form of food itself. It has also come under stricter national and international conservation guidelines. In Gabon, there are open and closed seasons for hunting, and logging concessions also have been charged with regulating hunting within its boundaries. However, this does not provide alternative year-round sources of either protein or income for those who depend on hunting as their only source of requiring either meat or rice and manioc bananas to feed their families. After the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, the possibility of the virus's zoonotic origins have also renewed global attention to bushmeat consumption and trade in the developing world. So a representative 2021 journal article published in PLOS Biology is entitled, "Wildlife Must Be Protected from Crime and Trade for the Sake of Public and Planetary Health." But this language, with its innate valuation of the importance of the public and planetary health, implicitly gestures towards a public that does not include these African publics, and a planetary health that does not include the dietary health of these same populations. After all, long-standing threats to public health in the global south have remained underaddressed. For instance, dengue fever, leishmaniasis, schistosomiasis have long plagued populations in the tropics, but have yet to see significant financing to search for remedies. In these calls for wildlife, then, we work for our own survival and our own futures. Here, I'm speaking on behalf of the West at large, rather than those of the same people who depend most directly on these animals and on these ecosystems. Perhaps then we can read or reread bushmeat consumption and trade as a classic mark of distinction following Pierre Bourdieu. For these Chinese loggers, bushmeat is reserved for special occasions to recognize the particular status of an invited guest. It is certainly not something that is eaten every day. For rural African households, however, bushmeat is an essential, if not only source of protein, now become also one of the only sources of cash with which to purchase food staples destroyed by elephant predation. At the same time, perhaps our own instinctive reaction to bushmeat consumption underscores a sense of our own distinctions from these faraway others, an instinctive distaste born of a different set of cultural values, further influenced by class and education. Of course, there is also the greater distinction between the foodways of developed countries and what we call undeveloped or underdeveloped countries, where this intimacy with the provenance of one's food has been long lost in the industrialized meat production of the global north. You can think of often pejorative associations that there exists between eating hunted meat in rural Appalachia, for instance, where in North America, hunting is considered a sport, not as a legitimate form of livelihood or as a way of feeding one's family. I don't wish to deny, of course, the real conservation concerns of the great and ongoing declines of wildlife, as was illustrated in the introductory presentation, nor the importance of wildlife as living animals, integral to the health of forest ecosystems, and valuable certainly as species in their own stake, right? However, what I think is important to recognize is that we need to be aware and recognize our own hierarchy of values, which we might take for granted, and our own separation from these same forests and peoples, which are based on a set of subjective cultural distinctions that often leaves little room for the practices of what we come to think of as the other. And what we call global priorities at the same time are often a reflection, perhaps, of our own specific interests here. So I want to close this relatively brief conversation or presentation with a few questions for conversation afterwards. Are conservation policies governing the bushmeat trade and consumption thus a reflection of our own Western tastes and values, formalized into legislation for enforcement elsewhere? Are our own foodways in the so-called developed world really preferable to the hunting consumption of bushmeat? After all, we eat factory farm chicken and pigs raised in cages and bred to grow at extraordinary rates to feed our own ever-expanding appetites for meat. After all, these are the same practices that conservation groups have tried to export to the developing world, to domesticate animals like goats and sheep and chickens that are considered more appropriate for eating, to take the place of the unfamiliar that is unfamiliar for us species that have long constituted an essential part of local diets. And in northeastern Gabon, we see the arrival of such domesticated meat, where chickens raised in Cameroon or even further afield are frozen and shipped and divided into pieces for sale in the village that you see pictured here. This to meet the demand of those who cannot hunt, but also in the face of declining wildlife populations in areas close to villages. Should we then imagine a preferable future where hunters become herders, or else service workers, in cities spending their salaries to buy such industrially produced meat flown in from elsewhere? thus to have a forest saved for conservation alone, with little possibility for human coexistence. In the end, and this is my final question, how do we become aware of the place of our own cultural preferences in defining conservation policies exported and enforced abroad, and thus to recenter, perhaps as an alternative, the legitimacy of the values of those who have lived most intimately within these forests that we purport to save for the good of the world? So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take either questions now or later at the end.
Thank you very much, Wen, for this enlightening talk. And thank you for shedding some light into the importance of reevaluating our cultural values to avoid perpetuating this dichotomy between the global north and the global south, and between the rural and urban populations. And indeed, we have questions. So I'm going to read the first one from Jerome again. So he said, thank you. You spoke about the Chinese impact on bushmeat, but was the colonial era part of creating this perception of bushmeat being a delicacy? Then he follows, in France and Belgium, local bushmeat, deer, boar, frogs, etc., is still seen as a delicacy. Has you also seen a difference in bushmeat consumption since zoonotic diseases have become a more prominent subject since COVID?
I can try to answer quickly. First, the second question. I don't think there's much difference in bushmeat consumption. I don't know if you're asking about Central Africa or China in particular, but in China, I mean, wildlife markets were closed after the outbreak of COVID-19. In Central Africa, I don't think for many there's an alternative to eating bushmeat, especially in very rural Gabon. You saw the instance of, the import of chicken from, say, neighboring countries, but flown in. Nonetheless, bushmeat is the preferred source of protein, being that this has been really the only source of protein for millennia in the region. Colonial era's part of creating the perception of bushmeat as a delicacy, I think bushmeat being a delicacy has been true for all kinds of foreigners arriving in the forests of Central Africa, being that it is enormously exotic, right? In its association with the forest, in its association with the otherness of the forest, for French, Belgian, and Chinese alike. So thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Wen. I think now we're gonna move to the next speaker. And then if there are more questions, we can address those questions after the next presentation. And I'm really, really thrilled to introduce our next speaker, which is João Vitor Campos-Silva, because I'm so inspired by his work. João is the president of Institute Juruá, an NGO that fosters sustainable development through community-based conservation in the Brazilian Amazon. And his work focuses on community-based solutions and sustainable use protected areas, and has documented community-led population recoveries of just as one example, the largest freshwater fish in the world, the pirarucu, while still providing food and incomes for local peoples. So I believe that João will be able to give us some hope and a little taste of the potential solutions to some of these problems that we have discussed today. So João, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luisa. I'm super happy to be here. I am super fan of this research group, so it's a honor. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I have, let me share my screen. Can you see my presentation?
Yes. Yes, perfect.
Great, great. So I brought this presentation trying to discuss some conservation issues within Amazonia in the 21st century, because now we are in a very important moment in Amazonia. Many things occurring, different actors working in Amazonia, and of course, conservation has a central point in those discussions. But when we think in Amazonia, in Brazil and outside Brazil, most people, it's not seeing my slides. Okay, most people think in biodiversity. Of course, it's a wonderful place in terms of nature, in terms of biodiversity. And now we are immersed in a wave arriving in Amazonia, which is the bioeconomy. So everyone is thinking about the potential of the biodiversity and natural resource. So many organizations, many people talking about Amazonia as a food systems, as a source of medicine, cosmetics, and many other biodiversity based value chains. However, so the world is looking to the Amazonia in a very, very strong way. There is lots of money arriving and many different actors. So of course, biodiversity is a central topic in this discussion. But if we look deeper to the Amazon, we also see a huge cultural diversity. So many different indigenous groups interacting with the forest for at least 12,000 years, and they have a very strong connection, coexisting with biodiversity in different ways, but at the same time, they are also building social technology. They are still relying on natural resource, but they also have very interesting models of governance, of natural resource management. And we believe that the traditional knowledge, the indigenous knowledge, can be a very important source of knowledge towards a more sustainable place with more social justice. So in the middle of this wave arriving in Amazonia, the central question is, how can we put together people and nature in the same package? Not to repeat the same trends that Rodolfo Dirzo showed us in the beginning, but to build new pathways towards a better future for Amazonia. And in this discussion, protected area has become the main strategy, not only in Amazonia, but in the entire world. And when we look at the map of Amazonia, we can see many and many protected areas. So it can bring us the feeling that the Amazonia is well protected. So we have strictly protected areas, we have national parks, extractive reserves, indigenous lands. But when we look deeper to those protected areas, we see that most protected areas are not implemented. They are paper parks. For example, in the state of Amazonas, which is the largest subnational political unit controlling the largest fraction of tropical forest on Earth, we have only 3 managers for 42 protected areas. So it is virtually impossible to ensure the protection and a proper management of those areas. In this context, we have been working in alliance with local communities to develop community-based conservation arrangements. So the idea is to decentralize the conservation, to build local empowerment, especially in terms of territorial empowerment, where local communities and indigenous groups can protect their territories. So in this perspective, we can reduce conservation costs, we can create natural resource management models that can both protect nature, but also improve the quality of life of those peoples. And this is an interesting opportunity for local development if it is built in the right way. So we have many examples around the world, and here I would like to focus in some positive examples that we have in Brazilian Amazonia. So the main question behind those community-based arrangements is how can we use the bioeconomy and biodiversity-based initiatives to promote and strengthen conservation? So we will talk about trade at local scale, but we will talk also about mechanisms that can ensure no-take areas, that can ensure the spatial zoning of the landscape to allow opportunities for local community, but also to allow a protected place where local people can stay 24/7 protecting the territory. Here is the Juruá River. Juruá River is a very emblematic place in Amazonia. Juruá River has become like a bright spot because there are some community-based initiatives where people are able to align biodiversity protection and local well-being. Juruá River was seen of a silent social revolution. People used to live almost as slavery during the rubber exploitation in the last century. And now they are leading some very successful examples of community-led conservation initiatives. They rely on several different types of livelihoods, including fishery management, acai palm fruit harvesting, rubber exploitation, hunting, and many other livelihoods. But here I will focus in the community-based management of giant species, which is the largest freshwater scaled fish on Earth. It's also a CITES species. And this is a very interesting case to think in another paradigm of conservation that I will talk later. Basically, this model is very simple. Arapaima evolved in an anoxic environment, so the fishes need to come to the surface to capture oxygen. And during this process, the fish can be counted. This is a video. You can see a group of Arapaima breathing. And during this moment, experienced fishers can count the number of the individual. So basically, after that, they are able to estimate how many individuals do you have in one single lake. And with this number in hand, they can send the number for the government, and the government can allow a fishing quota. And also another important component of this model is the territory protection. So every managed lake, they build a wood house in the entrance of the lake to avoid illegal activities, not only illegal fisheries, but also mining, logging, hunting. So the territory is completely protected, not only the lake. We calculated the area of protection, and it can be up to 50-fold higher than the lake. So they protect a huge amount of territory. Now in Amazonia, we have 5,000 people protecting more than 5,000 lakes. So, you know, if the state, for example, if we do not have the local communities, the cost to protect those environments would be very, 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 very high. And so, and then in this model, basically to start the Arapaima management, we have the spatial zoning of the fishing, which we call fishing agreements. Basically, we have 3 different types of lakes in the landscape. We have open access lakes where commercial fisheries are allowed. Everyone can go and fish. We have the subsistence lakes. Only local members from local communities can fish for their own subsistence. And we have the protected lakes, where fisheries are forbidden, except a couple of lakes can be managed once per year. So local communities enter in the lakes and then use the fishing quota to harvesting a number of individuals. The ecological impact of this model is very strong. For example, the population size of giant arapaima in protected lakes is higher than 500 individuals compared to only 9 individuals in open access lakes. And we also we see that in the last 15 years, the wild population of arapaima has increased 600%. And this model works very well outside formal protected area as well. We did an experiment implementing this model in many different places outside protected areas, and the wild population of arapaima has increased almost 400% in 5 years. So it is a very resilient species. There is a strong parental care of the babies, and the survival is very high. So the recovery rate is very high. And the protection benefits many other species living in the lake, including aquatic mammals, freshwater turtles, large catfishes, migratory birds, aquatic birds, caimans, and even invertebrates in the bank and in the flooded forest nearby the lakes. So arapaima is like a very efficient umbrella species that can benefit many other aquatic and semi-aquatic species. So basically we have in the landscape protected lakes with a high biodiversity, with emblematic species, with high value fish species that can be exploited. And we have the open access lakes, which is much more depleted, with much lower biodiversity richness. However, they are very, very important because the there is a trophic cascade phenomenon. Because we do not have top predators in unprotected lakes, the detritivorous fishes increase a lot in biomass. And those fish represent the main resource for local subsistence. So this is a nice win-win example where we have the protected lakes with a very high value for conservation, and we have the open access lakes with a very high value for food security of indigenous peoples and local communities. Beyond the conservation outcomes, we have very strong social outputs in this model. For the first time, women are earning their own income. So for a long time, women is involved with fisheries in Amazonia, but the income always went to their husband hands. Now they are participating of decision-making environments. They have a new source of income, and they are much more empowered. And one important thing is that when they harvest the arapaima, they receive all money comes together for the local communities, so they can receive like $100,000 in one time. So this huge amount of money can be invested in better infrastructure, better service. So when we compare communities participating of the arrangement and communities that do not participate, we can see strong difference in terms of production flow, sanitation, healthcare, shop, communication, electricity. So there are many important social services and infrastructure that can be implemented by the arapaima management. And also the social security is much higher in those communities. For example, last year we had 2 cases of cancer and 1 heart attack in those communities that we work. And people were sent to Manaus to receive a proper treatment, to receive a medical opportunity, and everything were paid by the arapaima. So 10 years ago, those people would die in the bank of the river without opportunity. So for those outcomes, we used to say that the arapaima is the fish of change, because it can induce a strong protection of the environment with multiple benefits for biodiversity, but it can also improve a lot the quality of life of local people. So in summary, we have in this model, beyond the conservation outcomes, we have income generation, infrastructure improvements, gender equity, social security, food security. When you have like a protected lake nearby the community, the catch per unit effort of other species is 3-fold higher compared to unprotected environments. We have territorial autonomy, we have cultural maintenance, and even we can see an increase in the self-esteem and sense of pride of those communities. So it has been contributing with the reduction of rural-urban migration. We can see that people participating of this arrangement are much more. There is a belonging sense much higher, and people outside this model are trying a better life in the small towns in Amazonia. And this is interesting because it's also a market-based solution, because the success of this model depends on the improvements of the value chain. We used to say that we still do not have like a fair trade on arapaima value chain, because it's very, very hard to compete with illegal fisheries. So when we are doing the community-based management, we also have many other fishers fishing in an illegal way. So when the production comes to the CITES, we have a strong competition, and we cannot pay more for the managed fisheries, for the managed arapaima. So we have like a clear market bottleneck that we need to solve to improve the condition of local fishers. But this is like a challenge that is very hard to solve by the local communities. We have a stronger protagonism from the government to control the illegal activity in Amazonia, and the illegal activities has become stronger every year. So basically, this example brings us an opportunity to think about conservation paradigm. For a long time, conservation for researchers and conservationists is something at the end, something that we need to achieve, like a project outcome or a project output. But actually, we believe that conservation should be conceived as a way of life. Because if we can provide a way of life based on conservation for those people, basically we will have like an army against the powerful force of deforestation, overexploitation, and habitat destruction in Amazonia. There is a phrase from Hatton Lau that I like a lot. He say that when people are poor, stricken, desperate, and starving, they pass on their sufferings to the land. But we also believe that when people flourish from the land will be better protected and more diligently cared for. So I think we are in a very important moment in Amazonia to change a little bit the conservation paradigm. For a long time, people were excluded from conservation perspectives, but now we are sure that without local people, we will not succeed because we will not have enough funding, enough human resource, and most importantly, we will not have legitimacy to implement top-down projects in Amazonia. So this is the student case. Thank you very much. I'm super available for further conversation. And Luisa, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a huge pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for this really inspiring presentation. Let me see if we have questions in the chat. It seems like we still don't have questions, but I can ask one question that I have, and then maybe if there's another question, we'll address it, and then we can open up for questions for all the speakers and also comments among the speakers. I was wondering, João, if you have a sense of how widespread this kind of community-based conservation initiatives, and not only for managing like food resources such as the Arapaima, but also like maybe in the tourism sector. It's like, how widespread are those initiatives across the Amazon, and also how can they be supported? Is there any way to support them to make sure they will continue into the future?
Yes, this is a good question, Luisa, because it was not my strategy until now. So the Arapaima started in one single community 20 years ago. Now we have more than 1,000 communities managing the Arapaima, and there are strong demands in all territories to implement the model. We have the same demand for indigenous territory, which is different because they want to protect their territory, not thinking in value chains, but we have a strong demand to do that. And I think that for us, the best strategy is to map those local aspirations and try to support the territory protection. You know, we can support these small-scale food systems where we can implement no-take areas, which is very important because these no-take areas will work as sources of individual source of biodiversity, and we also can support the indigenous aspiration in terms of territory protection and officialization of indigenous land.
Great, thank you.
Basically, we need people and funding to help to implement in a much wider scale. You know, but in the case of the Arapaima, it's like a dilemma because when you have a higher conservation success, you have a higher challenge in the value chain because the fish will increase their population, and then there is like a spillover, and then the illegal fisheries increase a lot. So we need to align the community-based conservation with government actions to regulate the illegal fisheries, to conduct stronger surveillances, you know. Otherwise, will be very hard because we have like the population trends increasing a lot, and we have the price corrected by the inflation dropping because the illegal fisheries do not allow a fair price. You know, for this reason, we are trying to implement like an export program of Arapaima. So we have been collaborating a lot with CITES authorities in Brazil. We have a couple of samples of Arapaima in Hong Kong, US, Canada, trying to find better markets where people can pay a little bit more with the commitment to improve this model, you know, because we can pay more for the fishers, so they will be much more happy to protect more and more environments, and yeah, that's it.
Makes sense. It's such complex issues. Rodolfo, do you have a question? You're unmuted.
I wanted to say, João, that related to Luisa's question, what you have there in terms of the spatial zoning that you made a reference to, in some sense, is very akin to the idea of the biosphere reserves on land as well, in which you will have precisely that kind of zoning, a core area in which you maintain the biodiversity as you showed in that beautiful comparison of the no-take and the open area. Then you will have what is called a buffer zone surrounding that core area, in which some activities, sustainable activities like what you discussed, are conducted. And then you have the external area where the impact is greater with other kinds of regulations there. In all of these things, regulation is kind of a key word, either locally in terms of the governance that is established by the local people and in connection with local governments, and then obviously internationally, and that's where CITES and other international programs and initiatives and connections actually come in. But I am delighted to see that this idea of the zoning and ecological mosaics are one way of making compatible the well-being of the local people and the maintenance of biodiversity at the same time of fighting this ancient idea, this archaic idea that is part of nature without people, and going back to precisely what we're trying to do in this workshop series, reconnecting people with nature. So what the three of you have presented today actually goes a long way in terms of our, sharing this idea with the rest of the people who are listening to us. And of course, the recording is going to be available for many other people to pay attention to this issue. I will stop here in case there are some other questions and also some conversations among the three of you and with us. And then at the end, I will try and make a couple of points to summarize.
Yeah, yes, Rodolfo.
Yeah,
it's very well
yeah,
pointed. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, because we are trying to implement in our organization, the main project in our organization is to develop a river basin conservation model. So the idea is to integrate formal protected areas, indigenous land, and those communities that are outside, they can be included in the same conservation perspective through fishing agreements. So it's very interesting. Now we have almost 2,000 kilometers of Juruá River with spatial zoning already implemented, with evaluations running, and we have been monitoring those populations over the last, almost over the last 20 years. And the results are very, very strong in terms of conservation outcomes and also quality of life. So basically, in the near future, we can think on how to implement those ideas in a much wider scale in Amazonia. I think the challenge right now is to understand which is the social and institutional ingredients that can make the model work. You know, for example, it's about leadership. We need leaders in those places, and how can we build new leaders? How can we work with young people to bring them for these leadership, positions? So there are some more psychological demands, social demands that we need to understand better to integrate with the conservation perspectives.
One possible avenue that I see in this very challenging question that you pose, how can we have those kinds of leaderships moving into this scenario? It seems to me that one thing that Yvonne mentioned, capacity building on the one hand side, and on the other hand, these local peoples have an incredibly powerful tool at their disposal, and they've been sharing that with us, which is TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. And when you come to those sort of convergences there, the potential of creating a synergy and then developing the leadership that you're addressing or that you're referring to, Joe, that is an option that I can see as a viable one to address this question of governance and
exactly
local.
that.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, perfect. Yes, when I talk about leadership, I'm exactly talking about community leaders, in those places, because they have a very strong knowledge about the territory, about the species. I see ourselves just as like an alliance. They should be the protagonists because they are living there, For us, we will pass away, we are in another place, but those local people are very important. And there is a huge difference. When you have like a strong leader in the front line, I'm sure that you have many similar experience, but when you have like strong leaders in the front line, things occur in a very, very positive way. So how can we how can we help to build those local leaders in every part of Amazonia? I think is a good question.
Other parts of the world as well.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Yvonne, I think Yvonne has her hand raised.
Yeah, well, super presentations. Thank you so much. Really, it's been very interesting and converging a lot on the discussions that we have when we talk about local communities and indigenous people and livelihoods. And I mean, it's proven that territories protected, areas with high conservation, with high biodiversity value are much better managed by local communities than indigenous people by far. And I think that this is proof that as long as they can benefit from it, they have to be able to benefit from it. And this is empowerment. And when you want to look for leaders, they have to be empowered to be able to make decisions about their resources, because often it's decisions making coming from the outside. And I had the opportunity to meet some women leaders at the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties in Montreal last year, who were saying, we want to learn, we want to know, teach us how to do something like a non-detriment finding so we know how much we can hunt, how much we can use. We don't need people to come from the outside all the time to do this for us. Build the capacity here so we can then work on it ourselves. And there's also a suspicion that there was always a suspicion when others come from the outside that we're trying to manipulate them and what was possible, and often saying, no, you simply shouldn't touch that at all. When they knew that there were possibilities, they have been doing it forever. They knew that they have to be careful because, of course, populations are increasing. So I think this empowerment, this building capacity, but more than anything, involving them from the beginning when we're taking decisions and we're working on conservation solutions. It's not, as you said, the traditional ecological knowledge that they have is very important when we are working on projects and programs. So it's been a real treat, and maybe later with the email group that we have, I can also send some ideas of who is actually working in these areas. UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, is trying to develop now what they call the wildlife economy, and possibly in all over at a global level. So you should join in those discussions and see, because they're trying to look for funding. They have actually some funding and they're looking for further funding. So I think they should be able to help some of these projects that are already going on.
Wonderful, Yvonne, wonderful.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I think there was another question for Wen as well. And the question is, well, the person is John, who's asking, and is basically asking, what's your take on the solutions? So the question says, what should we do? A wildlife conflict seems to come from large social forces unlikely to be undone. For example, village resettlement, large logging concession, pushing elephant to permanent villages, eliminating local food. So what's your opinion on what should be done in those cases?
This is like $1 billion question. I don't think
exactly.
Yeah, to provide a solution at all. I think I would just echo, what João and Yvonne have already said, in that the answers come from those who live there. Or, these are the people, right, who we should be following, in letting them take the lead, right? These are their lives, their futures, their forests at stake. And it's crucial, right? As has been mentioned earlier, that conservation benefits them, the people living there.
Wonderful. Are there any more questions?
Harman had a question.
Oh, okay. There's one question. I think this one was for João, but Yvonne and Wen are also welcome to comment. Are there any integrated conceptual frameworks that take into account local food sovereignty, tourism, conservation, with growing developmental aspirations of people, like healthcare access, as mentioned in João's presentation?
Yeah, we have been trying to develop like an integrated framework to work with these arrangements here in Amazonia. Basically, we try to bring to the Amazonian context the concept of One Health, the framework of Ostrom environmental governance, but we are also trying to develop like a frontline based framework which take into account the local aspiration, because we are talking about many different indigenous groups that has different epistemologies, cosmologies. So what's well-being for them? What means a better life or a good life for them? And to approach it accordingly with local epistemologies, we are trying to develop some local-based frameworks. Of course, that use what we have in the literature, but we try to co-design with local people. We have a couple of papers discussing those frameworks, but actually we still do not have nothing ready because we are like in the middle of a process.
One final question maybe, and this one might be towards Ivonne. What are the repercussions for nations who don't comply with your agreements? And have there been examples of where you've had to pass on these repercussions?
Indeed, there have been repercussions where, let's say at the smaller scale, if it's a specific species, like turtles and tortoises, or with trees more recently, that if it's found that there's overexploitation, that the amount of trade is too high, they will be asked to stop trade. There will be a recommendation to suspend trade in that particular species. And there's a notification that goes out, and this is all connected so that all parties, if you're a party to the convention, you have to follow the ban. You cannot import as an importing country that particular species or product of that species. And even the shipping industry, who will take, or planes, they will require a CITES permit, but they will also have the notification that says there's been a recommended suspension. So that's why it really has an impact. And I will give you the recent story of what happened with Mexico. And it actually has something to do with also the giant aparaima. Is it aparaima, João? The fish, you export quite a bit of the skins of this fish, and it was it affected at a global level several exporters of different kinds of products when we put a ban on Mexico because of the fact that they had not complied with an action plan that they had to prepare for the vaquita, which is a porpoise that is in the upper Gulf of California, because of illegal fishing of totoaba, which removes the swim bladder of the totoaba, and it gets sent to, there's a province and a small group of not small, but a small province that apparently this is a delicacy, or thought that it brings you strength. And again, as Wen was saying, it's something that you show off your wealth by providing to your guests. Having something like this bladder can cost $100,000, and a fisher can get $5,000 for this bladder in Mexico. So you can imagine how the legal fishing has overblown. But because the compliance action plan wasn't done, the standing committee had said if it wasn't handed in on time and with the proper and adequate, there would be a recommendation for suspension of trade.
Can you hear me?
And unfortunately for Mexico, because it's a species that's not being traded legally, it became a suspension of all CITES listed species from Mexico. And I understood that it was costing $150 million a day for this trade suspension. And quickly, the government sent a high-level team to Geneva to work on this compliance action plan, because also it affects local livelihoods for several species that they're trading in, like candelilla, which is something that get the red pigment that goes into lipsticks, and the skins, and all of this was being stopped. So you can imagine the strength of the convention that can stop international trade of that kind of $150 million a day. So, but it didn't last very long because they very quickly did what they had to do. So it's an incentive. It's terrible because it has a huge impact on many who have nothing to do with it, but it has caused, obviously, gives an incentive to make the changes that need to be made.
Thank you so much, Ivonne. I think Rodolfo, on the interest of time, we'll have to finish soon, but Rodolfo had some words he would like to say.
Thank you, Luisa. And maybe I can try and see if I can share my screen. Would that be possible for the last time? Promise. Okay. I wanted to come back to some points that actually came from the discussion, from the presentations of the three of you, and also from the questions of the audience. I'll come back to this image in 1 second, but I wanted to highlight some of the many fantastic points that were made in the presentation today, in the conversation today. One is that I don't know to what extent people were familiar with the diversity of topics and programs and critical issues that CITES is addressing. And I was so pleased that I'm supposed to be, very familiar with CITES, but what I learned today in terms of the many different angles that they touch to address this question of the survival and maintenance and use of this wonderful resource, which is our wildlife, including plants and animals, is just fantastic. From specimens, food, health, beauty, industries, and so on and so forth. So wonderful, and congratulations on the 50th anniversary for addressing that diversity of issues. And I am surprised that with such a small staff, and I don't know to what extent the funding is decent for the CITES effort, but I really want to call out and congratulate them on the 50th anniversary and be thankful for the many things that they do for this critical issue. The second thing is related to this figure that I used, and I didn't have time to address it properly. So what you see here is a number of locations that we found in the literature that we could obtain information about the magnitude of commercial and subsistence use of wildlife, in this particular case, animals. And as you can see, for many places where this predominant is a commercial subsistence, commercial use, industrial use, which is the most damaging one that we have seen, and the data are really very compelling about that. On the other hand, that you see in the yellow bars that the subsistence use of wildlife is represented significantly in terms of the proportion of hunters in only a few places. In other places, that proportion of people is very low. In this analysis, we do know that the most damaging kinds of use of wildlife is the red bars that you see there. The least damaging is the ones in which the local people are using them as subsistence and also as a cultural component of their lives. Many people have had traditional ways of interacting with wildlife, including the consumption, including other rituals and uses that they have. So it would be wonderful to support those kinds of activities and not support the commercial, massive industrial that are the most damaging ones. And the examples that we saw today are actually very significant in that regard. The kinds of things that can be done in this regard, we talked already about the capacity building component combined with traditional ecological knowledge. We can imagine that as we are losing wildlife and we're losing species and populations, we're also losing culture and traditional knowledge and so on. So we're really facing a problem of multiple extinction, biological extinction and cultural extinction. And the topics that we addressed today actually are relevant in addressing that very critical issue. We have to recognize the significance of the local communities in terms of being stewards and the supporters and the people who really have in their lands the biodiversity that we can sustain and we can look at and aspire for the future. In conservation arrangements, probably some of you know about this arrangement called PES, Payment for Environmental Services. It seems to me that we've come to the situation in which we need to recognize the local peoples, just as there are programs about the protection of water, the protection of forest coverage and so on. We need to be supporting also the people who are doing these efforts in maintaining the wildlife that we have today. Something equivalent to the PES should be implemented for the conservation of wildlife as well. And perhaps the last point that I want to mention is that in the context of what João presented to us today, the spatial zoning, the sort of configuration of the land and defining with scientific information, what are the different options that the land has to define areas that can be or should be maintained for conservation, areas that can be used in sustainable ways with attention to the local peoples, and then the areas that have more distance and can have other kinds of more intensive uses. All of that in combination of nature with people, reconnecting people and nature. The idea of recognizing the value of these products when they're obtained by local peoples, the certification component of those products is really relevant. I am delighted to see that examples such as the one that João presented is also percolating in other parts of the world. There's forestry management in different parts of the world in which farmers, local farmers and indigenous peoples are doing active extraction of timber in a sustainable way, with the money reinvested for the training of the local people and the maintenance of the forest and so on. So I'm really hopeful to see there are examples that are coming up around different parts of the planet. Because we talked a lot about working with local communities, I want to mention that now that I am embedded in this area of conservation that has to do with environmental justice, I think we need to think about 3 critical E's in terms of working with local peoples. One is the entryway, and for that we need to make sure that we have their trust when we do work with them. Second one is the engagement. That's a critical component. Now in this area, we talk about co-design, co-management, co-programming. We really need to do this in conjunction with those local peoples. And then perhaps the most critical one, at least from my perspective, one that I personally find more difficult, the exit. When you leave, if you're doing research, what do you leave for those communities? How do you make sure that you do not create false expectations? How do you make sure that you retribute it with some of the knowledge and information that is needed for those people's capacity building, attention to them, payment for environmental services, and so on and so forth. So this critical is, I think, going forward for the kinds of mission that we've been talking about today are essential for us to be paying attention to. I cannot imagine having had a more privileged set of panelists as we had today presenting and addressing these issues. I cannot thank enough the students who you've seen today, Chinmay, Marta, and Luisa, who have been behind the organization of these workshops. And also I want to make sure that I recognize the Division for Stanford Global Studies of the University, Stanford, for providing the funding to do these activities. And with that, I want to close and thank you all for the tremendous effort that you're doing for the world, for humanity, and for the future of us collectively. Thank you very, very, very much.